thanking God and praising him once again as we discuss the book of Nahum, this time thanking him for his intervention, as we mentioned before, in times when there seems to be no end to the wrong that we have to endure. Understanding that he is discussing the end of the suffering of his people, Israel, even though they were suffering for their own wrongs, by bringing an end to the reign of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrians, who, history tells us, invaded and conquered the northern 10 tribes of Israel. All that backstory aside, this time we were looking at the way in which there seemed to be no end to the dirt that Nineveh was willing to do, in spite of the mercy that God showed them through the prophet Jonah. This time, chapter 3, however, is going to describe their end, or seem to describe their end, this way. Starting out in verse 1, woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, no end to the prey. That's our title, pointing back to the metaphor that God seemed to use in the last chapter for the absence of an end, or there being no end to their treasure or the prey that a lion would accumulate in chapter 2. Going on, though, the first 3 verses are going to go on even further to describe the way in which there was no end to the consequences on other nations that they had plundered. Verse 3 saying, the hosts of the slain, the heaps of the corpses, the dead bodies without end. They stumble over the dead bodies. Verse 4 saying, and all for the countless whorings of the prostitute, graceful and of deadly charms, who betrays nations with her whorings and peoples with her charms, establishing her as seemingly being untrustworthy. Verse 5 is going to go on to repeat that theme of God turning on those, even those he once used to discipline his people, those he once helped to discipline his people, saying, behold, I am against you. Verses 5 and 6, going on to detail the ways in which he will lift up their garments to expose who they really were, what they had been doing. He will make nations look at their nakedness. He will throw filth at them. He will treat them with contempt and make them a spectacle, reminding us it's not just Israel to which he extends the warning that if they will not be exemplary, they will be made an example of. Nineveh seeming to reach that same fate here at the hands of God, who in verse 7 is once again going to make it clear he's talking about Nineveh when he says, and all who look at you will shrink from you and say, wasted is Nineveh, who will grieve for her? Pointing forward to what we'll see at the end of the chapter, seeming to say that they've done so much dirt, he's going to have trouble finding somebody to grieve or care about what's happening to them, much less to comfort them. Similar to the way in which Lamentations begins, talking about the condition to which Israel fell in the days of their own judgment. Verse 8, however, of this chapter, going on to say, are you better than Thebes? Verses 8 through 10, pointing them back to history to hopefully help them realize that if God has brought even greater nations to a destructive end, what do you think he's going to do to you? Nineveh in this case, but as we said, these are warnings to all nations. Understanding that in verse 11, going through verse 13, he's literally going to say, you also will be drunken. You will go into hiding. You will seek a refuge from the enemy. Saying that if you do not, as we sometimes say in our culture, those who do not learn from their history are sometimes doomed to repeat it. Having had the example in Thebes, having had the example of a nation they conquered in Israel, they didn't take the lesson, and now they are repeating the same mistakes. Verses 14 on through the end of the chapter, verses 14 on through the end of the chapter, or at least 14 through 16, beginning to describe the way in which he is challenging them, I guess, to accumulate whatever defenses they can, to draw whatever water they can, but they are not going to be able to quench the fire that is coming to beat at and consume all the things that they had accomplished, which are now about to come to naught. And if it is not the fire, it will be the sword, as he will say in verse 15, going on to say that not only will they not be able to quench the fire, even though they, in verse 16, have accumulated or increased many merchants, their money is not going to be able to help them. In verses 17, all of their wisdom or apparent know-how in accumulating all their success isn't going to help them, as he's going to talk about their princes and their scribes coming to nothing or scattering in verse 17. Verse 18, their shepherds, their nobles, and their people, once again being scattered on the mountains with no one to gather them. Concluding in verse 19, they are scattered thus because there is basically no cure for what God is bringing to them. There is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. All who hear news about you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not come your unceasing evil. Thus our title or our theme: there was no end to the dirt that they were willing to do. Therefore, going back to verse 1, even though they enjoyed a period where there seemed to be no end to the prey or the treasure they were able to accumulate, God is now poised to bring an end to the suffering of their victims by bringing an end to Nineveh, reminding me that these are not simply stories about ancient kingdoms, but their history has been recorded to help us understand God's MO, or modus operandi, as we have said, for dealing with us all, which is once again why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. May God give us a heart to stay away from the kinds of things that he is bringing an end to during the days that he brings an end to the suffering of his people.